I do think that they intertwine, of course, where like a lot of there's like fewer expectations versus Europe. Europe they have more social expectations from employee provided benefits versus America, but like I definitely think they're individual conversations that are intertwined further down the line. Um, so I guess like, do we want to talk about more what we should try to push American work culture towards socially versus push it towards legislatively?
I think those two are actually a lot more intertwined, and that the best way for us to push socially is actually incremental legislation. When people get a taste of like socialized medicine or some of these government programs, a lot of times they tend to actually like them. It's part of the reason why people will say they don't like Obamacare, but they love the Affordable Care Act. That's why the Affordable Care Act probably isn't going to be going away anytime soon.
Okay.
Is because when you expand these programs a bit by bit, not suddenly, moving all the furniture in the house, but instead just give people a taste, they tend to like it. That's why I think incremental reform is a good way to change social.
I have had a lot of interaction with socialized medicine with the VA, and it is the most trash healthcare I've ever fucking seen in my life.
The VA. So yeah, we could make particular criticisms about the way that the VA is done, but the thing is like we don't have to necessarily have like the government come in and run businesses for us, right? Like, no, like the government option is a separate thing. Because what I'm talking about, if we're trying to influence the culture, right? If you're worried, the thing is that if we institute legislation like this, right, then the work culture must necessarily change as a result. Part of the problem that we're talking about is like when again, like what you just hinted at, like the fact that like trying to get people to adopt a new system, like Trace was just talking about. A lot of the times these things are more connected than you might think when it comes to actually what it takes to adopt new policy, because the underlying question of why people aren't doing this themselves, why isn't this already being adopted, even when we can show in a lot of cases that not only the workers but the businesses themselves might benefit from it, is because like sometimes a really, really great idea where you can benefit from being a really, really good worker in a really good manager in a way that no one has ever done before, it might be really hard for managers who are mostly relying upon the wisdom of the herd when it comes to their management strategies and their experiences. It might be difficult for them to like adopt these new structures without some type of example being like forced upon them or incentivized to them, we might say.
So my question is like, so we look at like European policies towards vacation and stuff like that. Was that downstream of public opinion, or was that upstream, like downstream of political
people generally are always people I mean, like at a basic level, and I don't think this is a silver bullet or anything, some people might think it is, but generally speaking, populations are like almost always down for like work reform, less work, more flexible work hours. It's just a matter of instituting it pragmatically.
See, now I would like to see what Professor Meat made an interesting comment there. I don't know if he realized it or not. I wouldn't mind seeing businesses incentivized to offer more work flexibility and work vacation rather than it being regulated.
Yeah. And that's something we can even look at.
I am in favor of deregulation, but increase incentive. So give them a little tax break or whatever.
And that is what some places do it to, and I don't think he's totally against regulation, but that is an example of something we can try.
I'm not totally against all regulation. Some regulation's necessary. I mean, period.
And that is something we can try, and some places have tried that. There is a cost benefit analysis to be made there, but even more so than beyond that point, when I talk incentives, like when we institute certain regulations, even if it's not necessarily like a direct financial incentive, what ends up happening is now managers, there's this natural incentive that is created in like the job market where people are now have an increased incentive than they compared to where they did before to like have skills when it comes to their job, and other higher up managers are going to have increased incentives to hire people that are good at skills like managing the workforce, allotting time, like being more charitable to their employees when these things are actually incentivized through the structures in place, right? And when there's like, again, witnesses there that have to be in the meeting, and there's like at least some type of ideological precedent for these values and like in the workplace, and these conversations to like take place and be respectful. And so insofar as that is the case, like just that alone creates these natural incentives in the marketplace where people who are more capable, hey, there he is, of people who are more capable at managing in these types of ways are naturally going to be incentivized to, like, people, in other words, people are going to be incentivized to increase these management skills that allow them to institute these new policies in ways that are beneficial, because we've seen that, like, more flexible work structures can be beneficial for both workers and managers. It's just hard to figure out, and we don't have the blueprint. So sort of giving the population the blueprint might actually, like, give them the scaffolding necessary to start figuring out how to do it better and better, and, like,
So,
adopt it for themselves.
What type of workplaces are we looking for that in, though? Like, that's the actual question.
Well, so just for, so and to be fair, there are some examples where it becomes more difficult. There are certain jobs where, like, you'd have to make exceptions, where, like, where there's certain types of flexible work schedules that are not useful for them because there needs to be some level of consistency.
Yeah,
But
I would say it's not.
But we can make practical exceptions, right? Like, and insofar as that's the case,
Yeah.
like, when for our general prescriptions for society, like, it's actually crazy how many places that it can come up with. A lot of the time, the critics of these types of programs will bring up, like, how upper scale, higher scale management structures are, like, for like more for, like, things like what's the word I'm looking for? Like, more higher scale, let's say, for lack of a better word, things like a management, like a law firm or something. A lot of the people say that, like, it's really hard to institute these structures, like, practically and effectively in environments like this.
Yeah,
But-
I would disagree. That's where they.
Well, no, it's actually,
they
yeah, it's,
thrive.
well, no, exactly. In fact, there's some studies to bear this out. I believe there was one study I was looking at, Well something company. I think it was Australia, and it was I might be getting that wrong, but there was one study I was looking at where this one really big law firm. Maybe it was New Zealand. Again, might be getting it wrong. Where they had, like, 40% increase in worker productivity. Everyone was happier. Even the customers expressed higher satisfaction with the work that they were engaging in, and, like,
Yeah.
the cost paid for themselves.
And but that's where, like, when I go back to the original, like, thing where I was, like, expressing concern on the conversation is, like, do we want to focus this conversation on, like, that tier of work, or do we want to focus it towards lower income work or higher income work? So, like, when we talk about, like, lower income work, I think of my job at, like, Quick Trip, which is, like, a gas station. I worked there for, like, 2 years throughout my college years. Like, it's a 24-hour, like, gas station, and you're expected to work, like, certain hours, and you're supposed to, like, you get assigned these hours, you're supposed to meet those hours and stuff like that. There's no flexibility doesn't exist. And I would say that there's actually a lot of jobs in America that don't have the flexibility of hours because the work doesn't have the flexibility, not because, like, not because the management doesn't want to provide that flexibility, but because
The type of work.
yeah, the type of work just requires you to be places.
Which is dumb.
And how do we want to fix that versus, like, if we want to talk about middle, like, where I think where you're speaking from is, like, from, like, a middle to upper income bracket that has that like flexibility.
The problem is there's no such thing as a one size fits all. This is not going to be solved across the board.
Yeah.
We'll go to.
But even in these,
I want to go to Desperado. And then the new person. Cook.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
the type of income group that you're talking about is unskilled labor, and the main thing with that is that with unskilled labor, and this is not like a pejorative that I'm using to, like, make fun of people that work.
I agree.
I'm not using. I'm just saying that these are the type of jobs in which the training for them is minimal and the work is usually kind of strenuous. And the thing is that unskilled labor in almost every facet of it has an extremely high turnover rate. And these companies basically profit off the fact that they have the extremely high turnover rate. As a matter of fact, when I was in Minnesota myself, because I went to the University of Minnesota. So when I was working for Target, I worked my best friend in college was working for Target. Started working for Target right out of high school in, like, 2004. Started at, like, $7.25. By the time I got to Minneapolis to go to school, he basically was making $12 an hour. But Target had entirely changed their entire practice of paying their employees, and I was making $7.25 an hour, the same as he did when he started. And then after a year's worth of time, and I pride myself as having quote unquote good work ethic. After a year of working there, I went to go and see about my pay raise for the next year. I got a 10, or what is it? It was an 8-cent increase in pay
Fuck that,
for
dude.
after working an entire year.
Fucked
An
up.
8-cent increase in
So
pay.
you
where,
know quick
It's
where,
like a slap in the face.
where my buddy who had started in 2004 and was grandfathered into the system had literally gotten consistent like $1 increase in pay every single year or more, until finally, what is it? They changed the entire system for unskilled labor and made it so that like I would have to work for the company for like 6 years, become a team lead, and then after like working 6 years at minimum wage, basically getting like 10-30 cent raises per year, then I'd become a team
the
lead.
minimum increased,
Right, and then
Otherwise,
I'd get move up to full time. So they literally profit off the fact that everybody is working part time and everybody's getting crap hours and no one's getting 40 hours a week.
The very
and this
low
is all
friction. The very low friction employment is a really big like obstacle
Right.
for like unions or things like that to try and solve
Right.
for when
Yeah.
people are especially
And-
working as contractors or working multiple jobs at the same time. It's a real challenge.
Yeah,
And if we're talking about
this
lower
isn't a
income-
contract position. This is just a
Unskilled
part-time
labor.
position that he's
But
talking
even-
about. Unskilled part-time. Whereas like I'm like a skilled contract labor. He's talking about something completely different. That's actually like, this is why like I wanted to like ask the question of the panels, like where do we want to focus this conversation on? Because like I feel like there's so many different types of work that occur that we almost have to focus this in a little bit more specifically, because like
Well,
what
we're
do
gonna
we
see a
wanna
lot of
make
the same-
legislation on?
Well, we can generalize the legislation to a large degree because almost all brackets stand to benefit. To some
I
degree from this, right?
highly disagree.
Well, no.
I
So let me get you an
super
example.
disagree.
It's a
Let's-
utilitarian
let's-
approach.
Let's
Yeah,
figure out
there's
which
no
groups are
way
hurt
you
most.
can. There's
We
no
can
way you
use
can
with
make an
this.
across the board thing. My
Can
situation
I jump
as
in,
a
guys?
pilot is wholly different than a room slot position as a contractor. It's
Yeah.
completely, and what would benefit him would have. You
all
can't.
different.
It's not a one size
yeah.
fits all.
Yeah.
But
Don't
here's the
forget,
thing,
I
though.
believe
Even
that-
I'm familiar with everything that Desperado's
teacher,
talking about.
right?
Let's
Is
let
that
Goop
right?
in here. Let's let Goop in here for a second.
And what you need
Hey.
is totally different than what I need. It's
Yeah. Sorry,
you
sorry,
can't
Coop.
have
I'm
one size fit all.
I'm going to come in from a slightly different perspective. One, I'm Canadian, so our labor laws are slightly, if not very significantly different from yours. I'm also a human resources professional. I have a bachelor's on that topic, and I
Yep.
would say
Okay.
there are some things we can legislate across the board.
Okay.
Those things are mandatory paid vacation leave, which if I'm well informed, are not like you don't have a standard minimum across the U.S. Where I'm from in
No.
Quebec,
Not at all.
after like 2 years, when you start in your first year, you're required to have 2 weeks of paid vacation at your regular hourly rate. When you reach 3 years of seniority, you go up to 3 weeks. Those are things that you can apply across the board, from highly skilled labor to low skilled labor. Fact is, when you get in higher skilled labor, those things are minimums. You can set the ground floor, and those are things that have a disproportionate impact on low workers. And another point that was brought up is how do we legislate flexible schedules for low skilled jobs? Those are not things that are easily legislatable. The way we can affect those jobs with positive change is by including viable alternatives for low skilled workers that are a lot more value added and that include a minimum level of specification. It's not true that as an employer you want to have the highest turnover rate possible. It is contrary to all incentives and practices in
It's
human
very-
resources.
yeah.
What you want is to have a
Mhm.
underpaid and full retention, which you don't get, and that's the
Yeah.
trade-off.
Yeah.
But
But with more flexible work hour systems. So if we're going to talk about the ways that these benefit like lower skill labor versus something like a law firm, for example, like this is the thing is that at a lower skill, if we're going to differentiate those things, lower skill labor is actually, especially in our country where we currently have a labor shortage, like lower skill labor is actually going to be one of the things that are immediately addressed by, for example, like more options for like flexible work hours available to employees.
No,
you don't
they
think you don't think
They-
turnover would be
they
decreased
offer
by allowing
different
flexible work
incentives.
hours?
it really
They
depends.
offer
Hold on.
different
I just want
incentives.
to be clear because I
Yeah.
don't want my question to be misconstrued. Are you saying that you don't think that the issue of turnover in the workplace in low skill labor would be to some extent addressed by allowing people more flexible work hours?
No, because I'd say most low skill
Hold on,
labor is
but no,
gonna
people
they
are
have set
absolutely
schedules, so flexible scheduling is not actually a solution. The actual solution is like usually like say I think of like Quick Trip,
no, absolutely.
24 hour. They offer sign-on bonuses to get people in like to do like overnight shit.
I'll give you an easy example.
That's
right?
like what they actually do. Yeah.
Here's an easy example of how this is actually not the case. So we're currently experiencing a labor shortage in the low skill labor market, right?
Yeah.
But
I
like
agree.
as a DoorDasher, for example, like this is I mean this is just basically all contract work around like for example to some extent ride sharing, but especially like DoorDash, Uber Eats. These things are an example of how like people can be incentivized when they like I would say there's a large portion of the low skill labor market, it seems, that don't necessarily need to work in those jobs to live. And so there's like to some extent the low skill labor market in certain industries is being caused by the flexible work hours that are available towards people, that they're more incentivized towards, because in some situations, in not all, they're better benefited. It's better for their lives, for the value, for what they're trying to get out of life by being able to engage in these flexible work hours. I can absolutely speak to a large degree of the population who are making these decisions to not engage in certain low skilled jobs because they don't have flexible work hours.
Well, I would say that like a lot of low skill positions just don't have flexibility. And I think Z Coop has like probably a better statement on that whole.
Yeah. The lower skilled jobs are harder to have flexible work hours because they are usually retail, food services, or production, which are things that need consistent human presence 24 hours a day. So in those spaces, it's very hard to have flexible work hours. And there is an alternative. Like I said earlier, you mentioned DoorDash and like contract work. Those things are on aggregate lower paid hourly on a total compensation because they offer those flexible benefits. It's a choice of total compensation, and a lot of the things that people don't account for in those is how they use their own resources, like using their car or for Uber or DoorDash. Those are resources that you have to pay, but people don't do the accounting work to consider in their hourly rates.
In some cases, this is the case, but I will just absolutely say, like, in my personal experience, we can.
On aggregate, it is the case.
Sure. But what I'm just saying is, what you're speaking to is the degree to which like certain populations can be more aided than others with policy like this, and that's a fair differentiation to make. I just want it to be clear that even there is significant populations, even within lower skill labor markets, that still stand to benefit directly from policies like this to some degree. I just wanted to be clear about that.
To the higher,
they're smaller.
They might be smaller, but that's why there's general like degrees of legislation that can benefit people across the board.
That whole idea even transcends to the high skilled positions.
So
there is a total work incentive package that you have to look at: compensation versus time, dedication, etc. I chose not to fly for the airlines because I didn't want to be out of town sleeping in hotels constantly, so I chose to fly for corporate, for business, business jets when I got out of the military. It let me 99% of the time. 99% of the time, I was home in bed every night, my bed. I didn't make as much as a Delta some 757 captain, but that was worth the trade-off to me, to have that capability to be home every night. So that's not just the quote-unquote low-skilled worker that has that transcends across all levels.
So one thing I was going to say is when it comes to people, it's not necessarily flexible hours. It's the fact that people in those low skill or unskilled labor positions, they want to work a 40-hour week. They want to be able to have those hours. And even if you have flexible hours, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get full time. And the majority of those people want full time.
Can I like compound that as well real quick, and then we can have Zay kind of like answer this. So like one other issue that like I find with like these low income jobs, or at least the one when I worked it and stuff like that, was that not only like, okay, you like when you talked about benefits that Canada can provide for like employees of different companies, are you speaking from the perspective of like, okay, they get a minimum a week, 2 weeks vacation and stuff? Is that for full-time employees, or is that like something for also part-time employees? So like, I worked at QuickChip for 2 years as a part-time employee, so like my net hours was underneath 28 hours a week over the 2 years that I worked and stuff. So would I see that type of benefit within Canada? And yeah, okay. I think you understand my question.
It's complicated is the answer.
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
Canada has like, or a US parallel has a federal labor law and provincial labor laws. The federal labor law is dog shit. It's worse than US labor law in general. Like there are no rights there, but like there are a bunch of companies that are like railways, banks, and like telecommunication companies that are working over there, which is super high skilled labors. So that gets evacuated out the window just because of raw bargaining power. Where I help from in Quebec, you, as an employer, you are legally, as part of total compensation, required to put away 4% of the wages you pay into a bank that is used for vacations. So as a part-time employee, you have a bank of vacation money that you are accumulating over the time, across the time you work. And
regardless of hours worked.
Regardless of hours worked, the percentage, the more hours you work, the more vacation time you earn, and you earn 4% of your wages. So that ends up to 2 weeks of vacation a year. And that, as a part-time worker, if you don't have a set schedule, like you work on Monday, Tuesdays every week, then if you don't have a regular schedule, you are allowed to take those vacation hours at any time, even at every single paycheck. But if you have a regular schedule, I believe the employer where I hail from is legally required with a previous notice of like 2 or 3 weeks to allow you to have that time off.
See, I think that would be a really cool, like, actual legal thing that we can implement into the US system, where it's like, regardless of like the hours of work that you have, whether you're part-time or full-time, that's actually like, if you're doing a percentage of the work that you're actually providing, you get a certain like benefit out of it. Because it's hard in America, like, where, you know, as a part-time worker, you don't get certain obligations, whereas like as a full-time worker, you get, you have, like, they have to provide you health insurance, or they have to provide you XYZ or stuff. But, you know, most companies, I think in America, like, will try to find every instance in which they can avoid this, where, like, you know, as a contractor, I'm gonna have to pay for my health insurance. The company will like subsidize part of it, like 1/5 of it, or 1/4 of it, or a third at most. But like, that's just, they do that as an incentive to contract through them, rather than as a requirement from the
where I hail from, like, contractors are like super rare, and you have to have a very, like, the law is, and the rulings on
very
this
specific,
are very specific on what is considered a contractor.
Almost like California.
If I could like piggyback off something.
Okay, go ahead.
If I could piggyback off something you guys were talking about, like with some Canada's like minimum allowances like that employers have to provide, and kind of we were talking about earlier was like oh gosh, what's the word? Like legislating, like incremental legislation, like something that I think is that we can actually see that's really good. That it's kind of like you get the, it's like a, you can see like the downstream culture from the legislation almost is like, I can't remember when exactly it was, but we passed legislation here in America where essentially companies that had over 100 employees at a single business had to provide health insurance. And in my fields of work, at least, like hard labor fields, like oil fields and shit like that, once that became standard for larger section companies with over 100 employees, essentially downstream from those companies, the smaller sub companies around them that were still like in the area of hard labor had to start giving their employees health insurance anyway, just so they could compete. And then we saw this like downstream cultural effect where, guess what? Now your citizens are looking at the jobs in a more competitive manner, going like, hey, why would I go to work with you if you don't even have health insurance, when it's becoming legislated that these guys basically have to? So like the incremental legislation is something that's really positive, and I don't know a lot about the flexible hours. I think that's really dependent on what type of work we're
Legislating
talking about.
that is a dog shit
impossible.
idea.
It would be really
It's legit
difficult.
impossible.
Yeah, and
It's
it would
a
be like
dog
really
shit idea in
sectional.
my book.
Legislate.
But, like,
You're
why?
better
yeah,
off.
like,
You're
Why
better
is that
off
incremental
having.
legislation
You're better off
would be
having. What is
a
it?
lot
The
of things.
companies hire like majority full time for those positions in unskilled labor, and having like a minority that's actually part time. That would be probably the best way to go about that.
The
Full-time
reason,
manager, part-time
But
employees.
how do you get people to do that?
the reason why you don't want to legislate flexible work hours, it's because it can't be applied to many industries. And those industries are some of the industries that provide jobs to lower skilled people.
That's
Having flexible work hours in retail doesn't work, because you need to have somebody as a cashier at the end of the day. Somebody to be in the store, and you can't have that
No,
flexible.
so flexible hours. So flexible work hours don't necessarily. So like, they don't necessarily have to be hard lines where we like decide. You get to demand that you work in a certain way, right? This is why I say that like the UK is like a more reasonable example of how you can change the culture from the top down. And they don't even let you like workers demand that they work certain necessarily flexible work hours, but it allows like sort of legislative precedent channels that exist to like force a conversation to be able to be engaged in a more respectful manner, in a more attentive manner between the worker and the manager about potential flexible work hours. But also, it allows. I forgot what my second point was, but oh shit. But it allowed. This is an example of it also, instead of like there's others legislation, for example, that instead of like allowing workers to make hard determinations about like working less per se, what they do is they just change the thresholds for overtime, right? And that, like, this is like, there's no hard determinations being set. There's still ways for people to like engage in pressures of the workers to some degree to like fill these slots, fill these hours at the end of the day. It's just that like the relationship sort of passively, semi-passively, like can still be like pushed in a certain direction between the workers and the employees.
I agree that you can have things related to like worker and work regulations that favor more flexible work hours. What I'm saying is you can't codify flexible work hours. That is something that just like on its face doesn't make any sense. Quebec has probably the most progressive worker protection legislation regimen in North America, and even our union centrals, to my knowledge, are saying like we can't legislate that. The unions are saying we can do it on a case-by-case basis depending on the industry, but we can't have blanket flexible work. So if the unions are on board, to my knowledge, in the most progressive like worker legislation in North America to say it is not a good idea, I will back them and say it is not a good idea, because I think it falls on its face. And yes, saying like overtime starts at 40 hours a week. After 40 hours a week, you have mandatory increased pay, like I have where I live. Those are all things
everywhere in the United States too, as well.
This is an example, like again with the UK, like there seems to me to be a spectrum here, though, where like there's a point at which we can like try to be too heavy-handed with these policies in a way that will hurt, right? But like what would you say about the UK example I gave, right? Like, because this sounds to me to be an example of like
familiar with the UK example.
Well, so like the example that I've given, right? At least. Well, sorry,
you need to go more in depth in it, because
let me just ask Z Coop. Let me just ask Z Coop, because he's the one who offered the criticism. Like in the examples that I explained, at least, it seems to me like you would consider this to be a more reasonable example of how you could like more passively, in a more reasonable way, shift.
I think you need more.
Can he answer, please?
Let him.
No, he can't answer because you haven't provided enough information for him to answer.
Z-Coop, all right. Open his mouth. Yeah, I think he can answer for himself. Z-Coop, given the like, I'm assuming you understand the sort of examples that I gave, right? So assuming.
I went to Google and I think I partially understand now. One thing I will say that I have in Quebec that I might do a parallel and I find is a good way to legislate somewhat flexible work hours. Although I don't consider it flexible work hours. Flexible work hours, by my definition, is the capacity to adjust on a daily basis or on a weekly basis your working hours. but they are things that I can see that you can legislate to help have a more work-life balance. One of the examples that we have is for parents. They're allowed to force their employers to allow them up to 2 days a year of time off or reallocated hours, for example, to attend their child's school event or a parent-teacher conference. Those are things that you can legislate. My kid is sick at home. I am allowed to have my work schedule change on a short notice for me to have a better work-life balance. Those are things that you can legislate, but those are things that are very punctual, time descript, and happen under very specific circumstance. Yes,
So the reason,
those
those
are legislatable.
Well, yeah, and what I would say, I guess, is just that like the reason I bring up the UK example is because that's an example, at least insofar as I described it, because I'm not going to say it's perfect in its implementation, but like what I'm saying is that like this is an example of how legislation can, without forcing, by and large, without forcing employers to like necessarily be without putting employers into a situation where they're being legislated into a corner and necessarily forced by and large to engage in more flexible work hours for their employees. What it does is that, because again, on a case-by-case basis, you can agree, right, that like there are situations where these type of management structures can be beneficial, right? And so that's the thing, though, is I think there are types of legislative policies we can institute that enable these types of doors to be opened and these types of discussions to be had between managers, between employers and employees. And that way you can like start to build this scaffolding within your society for letting them decide on a case-by-case basis how to engage in these things most effectively.
So
The problem you run into, the major problem you run into with the flexible hours things is that this is an ambiguous term that corporations love to use with flexible hours.
Yeah.
The problem is like when you actually go
What
and
does
you
that
work
mean?
for like a retailer, or you go work in the service industry or the restaurant industry, someone who's working on like a flexible hour system, all of these companies basically have an hour by hour like price gauge at exactly how much revenue that they're bringing in. If they drop below a certain point that they had the previous year, they'll just start cutting people and telling people to go home. So you'll have somebody that'll be on flexible hours, and then all of a sudden they'll have worked 2 hours, and then the manager come up, hey, you're on flexible hours, so you need to go home. So because we're not making as much money as we did last year, and we need to send somebody home. And they do this in the restaurant industry, the retail industry, and the service industry. So this is a major problem with the idea of flexible hours itself.
I
thing, no, but
what
you
you
can't-
ask me is what do you mean by flexible hours? Like I need to know what you mean because I haven't heard what you mean.
So,
by it.
for example, just I wouldn't define it specifically as like an hour a month.
I need
It's not necessarily. It's not.
specifics.
So
Like, I need
one
like
example.
what do you
Yeah,
think
yeah.
is
I'm
this-
trying to answer.
Okay,
So,
okay.
So one example of what, like, if there's lots of different ways that you could define this, and there's lots of different approaches you could take. But if I'm going to try to typify it with one example, right? There are programs like. There are the programs in the UK, like they have institutions in place for workers to try to seek, I don't know, a 5-day work week, a 4-day work week, less hours. Like a lot of people try to define these things as, especially in these studies, as like decreased work hours for equal pay, which is a whole other thing that we can get into a cost-benefit analysis of, because it is risky. It's more beneficial when you apply it on a case-by-case basis. But like what I'm specifically would most strongly advocate for is just opening up legislative doors for these conversations to be had between employer and employee, and seek out these situations on a case-by-case basis themselves. Because what we find, for example, to some extent in the UK is that when we have like formalized ways in which people are held to these standards of how they have these interactions, what we find is that sometimes, not all the time, of course, so those problems that Desperado was talking about will still exist to some extent. But what we can do is we can at least give room for some situations that didn't exist before, where people are able to engage in flexible hours that they normally wouldn't have been able to, in a way that benefits the worker and the employee.
So you mean
if I
like
could help you out a little bit there,
go for it.
or Professor Meat, like I looked up like the UK flexible work hours deal, and I think like like what he's talking about is he's not talking about like directly like legislating flexible hours for every single job right now.
Right.
The legislation looks like it's a system to which employees can go to their employers, and everybody can do this to
And ask for,
apply
like, 410
for potential
or-
potential flexible hours at their case by case basis. So it's not talking about like we all need flexible hours now. It's setting up a ladder system for the case by case basis to be able to like start
Make
getting
requests
towards
of
flexible hours.
of the jobs to like be more flexible towards
Yeah.
like, hey, I want to do a 410 instead of a 5/8.
So there's,
or
like, a
I want to
system-
do this. You
Right,
know,
and
like-
there's they've been going back and forth with they recently technically removed the appeals process, but there's still a process by which you can appeal to there's a tribunal or something like that. But it does, even though I'll admit there's lots of flexibility that is allotted to companies to like in models like these, and it's not necessarily perfect in this particular example, but even in these models, even though in these models there are like lots of flexibilities allotted to companies and employers to like give reasons to reject these requests and dismiss them. Like, I think there's evidence, at least in some cases, like we have evidence, basically, we have proof that in a lot of cases, even employers can benefit from these things. So